Okay, I would like to call the meeting to order, and first apologize for our getting a little bit of a late start, but thank you for your patience. We are not a full committee today, but we do have a quorum. We're minus 2 members who, for health and other reasons, were unable to make it today, but we do have everybody else in good standing. So that's the first thing that I'd like to say. Secondly, I'd like to say it's nice to be back in my hometown, thereabouts. I grew up, I'm a Laconia High School graduate, so it's good to be in Laconia. And I grew up in Guilford, to be specific, but it's good to be here in Laconia. We're going to start with approval of the last meeting's minutes.
I'd like to offer an amendment, Mr. Chair. It reads as follows. I think each of you have a copy. Committee member Jim Splaine asked Mrs. Puchetz when she refers to elected officials, is she referring to the Secretary of State staff or people who live in that community? She said that she is referring to locally elected volunteers at the polling place, the moderator, and whomever they designate for the election process. Mr. Splaine asked if these volunteers are residents of the polling district, and she confirmed they are. If that is seconded, I'd like to briefly explain.
Do we have a second for this amendment?
Second.
Well, we have a second.
I felt that it was imperative from everything I've heard, and good Secretary of State David Scanlon has emphasized this as recently as yesterday on a New Hampshire Public Radio program, that we make it clear for the record that it is volunteers, as really neighbors of the community, locally selected or elected, who do the vote administration. And there's some over 300 polling places in the state that do that. So I think that it needs to be as part of the record. I think that is an extraordinarily important part of the discussion we had 2 weeks ago. So I offer the amendment with that intent in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any more discussion regarding the amendment from members of the committee? Seeing none, hearing none, is there a second to the motion? We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. So now we'll move to approving the amended meeting minutes. The minutes are passed and approved. We will next move on to the presentation by our resident pollster, Mr. Andrew Smith from University of New Hampshire. You can give us your credentials, and we look forward to your testimony. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to the Commission and to the people who come today. I think this is a very important thing to look into in New Hampshire. I'm in the political science department at the University of New Hampshire.
Could I just get your name?
Oh,
Andrew Smith.
Andrew Smith. So I'm in the political science department at UNH, and I teach courses on public opinion largely because I do I'm also the director of the UNH Survey Center. So I do courses on public opinion, research on public opinion, elections, especially New Hampshire elections. And I've been covering New Hampshire elections since I moved into the state in 1998. It's starting to seem like a long time. I have prepared a kind of a PowerPoint presentation which I will submit to the committee, and you can have that as my testimony. I want to start off by taking just a moment to focus on the idea of voting itself, because I think this is really a critical and central part of what you're examining. We often ask why people don't vote, but we seldom ask why people do vote. Downs et al., Anthony Downs wrote a great book called The Economic Theory of Democracy, and he has basically says voting is essentially an economically irrational act because there are costs involved with voting. You have to take the time to go vote, maybe time off work, kids babysitting, you have to learn something about the candidates, you have to pay attention to what issues are out there. So there are some actual costs there that take real time. And if you think about the benefits that you get from voting, the odds of your individual vote making the difference in winning and losing an election is essentially zero. So even in a small town election where you have 1,000 people vote, your vote is 1 out of 1,000. It's quite small in the overall impact. It's the collective action voting that is critical, where a lot of people vote and you have an accumulation of votes that matters. But to an individual person, your vote's not really worth a whole lot, your individual vote. There's really no sense that you're going to get any personal benefit out of who wins the election. You know, it's not like your brother-in-law is going to get elected to get a job someplace or something like that. For most people, that's not the issue. So why is it that people vote? And Downs basically says it's the psychological benefit that's of voting that's important. You vote because it's something that you think is important, that's important for your society, it's important for government, it's important for you as a person. Most people who vote because their parents voted. We often encourage people to take their kids to the polls when they vote to get them in the habit of understanding this important role in our democracy that voters have. But it's that psychological benefit that we're doing the right thing, we're doing what we're supposed to do that's really critical. But that relies on trust that what you're doing is meaningful. And that, I think, is why it's very important to foster that feeling and to make it so that people think that the voting is important. I fear that perceptions that elections are not fairly run or that people are being kept from voting because of legal barriers are both concerns that reduce this sentiment that voting is good. So there are a lot of overall concerns I have. So we often look at voting as turnout as a critical indicator of kind of the health of a democracy. Higher turnout usually is correlated with people believing in the system. I would say that's not always the case. You have very high turnout in countries like Australia, largely because if you don't vote, you get fined. You had very high turnout in the Soviet Union elections. You had other things happen if you didn't vote there. And also in the United States, we've had our lowest levels of turnout, times where the economy was good and things were going along pretty good. And when turnout is low, it's maybe an indication that people are satisfied with the status quo. That's not always the case, though. It's critical to look at other factors that drive turnout. There are certain things that political scientists look at. We've got demographics. Older people vote more often than younger people. Higher levels of education, higher levels of income correlate with higher turnout. If you have a higher level of civic education, you're more educated about politics, you tend to vote more. And if there are actual real campaign events that are going on in your state, you're more likely to vote than if there's not much chance that your vote is really going to make any difference at all. So we have to remember there's no one cause of higher or lower turnout, but that's, I think, unfortunately used as a measure of trust in our elections, trust in society as turnout. But I don't think it's necessarily the case, but why trust matters. So I do research public opinion, and my research really doesn't focus on the actual legitimacy of elections, whether they actually counted right, getting details that way, because frankly that doesn't really matter. It's the perceptions that people have that matters. If people perceive elections not to be trustworthy, they're going to assume that they're not, regardless of what information they have to look at. So those public perceptions are important, perceptions more important than reality, because eventually perceptions become reality. And I have a chart that will be in my presentation that looks at something that Pew Research Center did. Before the election in 2020, in October, they did a study and asked people if they believed that the elections in the United States were run and administered very well, somewhat well, not too well, or not well at all. So before the election, 62% of Americans thought the elections in the U.S. were run either very well or somewhat well. After the election, that was 59%. Not really much change. But if you look at the internals of that, you see a big difference, and I think this is the problem that we're having in society. Prior to the election, 50% of Trump voters believed that elections in the U.S. were run and administered either very well or somewhat well. After the election, that went down to 26%. 1 month. Among Biden voters, prior to the election, 72% thought elections were run very well or somewhat well. That went up to 94% after the election. Now, there's a bit of a sore loser syndrome that goes on with this. If you look back at the 2000 election, it was Democrats who thought the elections weren't run particularly well and they didn't trust the outcomes, and Republicans thought everything was just fine because their guy won. So there's a bit of that going on. But that distrust, I think, is the thing that lingers on. I want to mention briefly about turnout in the United States, and again, I think this matters. New Hampshire has enjoyed high levels of turnout for many, many years. Look at why this is the case. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I think we have more elections than any other state in the country. Secretary Scanlon can probably vouch for that. We elect our legislature every 2 years, our governor every 2 years. We have primary elections in each of those cycles. We have the presidential primary, we have town elections, municipal elections. We kind of know how to do elections. And to your point, Mr. Splaine, the fact that these elections are run largely by volunteers. Volunteers who run for the privilege or the misery of running elections is something that I think is really unique to New Hampshire. I'll just tell a little anecdote about that. Many years ago, I was UNH, a team of people at UNH was working on a grant that I do believe came from the Pew Center that was looking at training election officials in the wake of the 2000 election. And I was talking with researchers in many other states, and they were talking about, well, their state, the Secretary of State assigns who's going to do the elections, and they do it all in a centralized way. And I said, well, that makes it easier for training people, but in New Hampshire, we've got supervisor the checklist, and the moderator does this, and the clerk does this part of it, and they're looking at me saying, what do you mean that you do it voluntarily? Yeah, these are elected officials that run for the job to do this, and they take it very, very seriously. And they were stunned by that. We're maybe one of the only states in the country that has that sort of a system where it's really run by volunteers. And those volunteers, to your point, I think are very conscientious about the work that they do. So our turnout is high, I think, in part because we trust the people who run our elections. We know who they are. We elect them. We vote for them to run our elections. So we've had high turnout. We're about 20 percentage points higher than the country as a whole. You can look at other states, their turnout is up and down a bit. But it really turnout is driven by motivation. There's little evidence in the political science literature that shows that barriers are significant, legal barriers currently. Now, we're not talking about during the Jim Crow area, but current legal barriers to voting are significant hindrances. Yes, they are kind of pains in the neck for most people, but if you want to vote, you can vote. It's not that difficult. States that have made voting much easier have not really seen the kind of dramatic increases in turnout that one would expect. And I'll talk about this when we get to ease of voting a little bit later on today. Oregon, for example, instituted all-mail voting many years ago. Their turnout bumped up a little bit, but was then largely flat, and it increased in the last 2 elections, but so has every other state. So the barriers aren't so much there, even when we make it so that everybody gets a ballot delivered to their house and they mail it in, pretty simple. That doesn't necessarily increase turnout that much. We in the United States have had kind of 3 levels of turnout, 3 eras of turnout in the last 50, 60, 70 years now. In the 50s, up until about 1963, 64, we had fairly high levels of turnout, averaging over 60% turnout in presidential elections every year. That dropped pretty much during the 1970s and up until about 2000, where turnout was averaging around 52 to 53% of the voting age population. And then since 2000, after the contested election in 2000, we're seeing that turnout is back up in the high 50% range. And you can go into the reasons for that. The big reason for the drop is that we passed the 26th Amendment that let 18 to 20-year-olds vote, and there were a lot of them back then. We expected them to go out to vote in part because of the Vietnam War and so forth. They didn't vote. younger people still generally don't vote. But that's been, the baby boom has been kind of digested into the system, and the partisan conflict that we've seen since 2000, I think, is one of the reasons we're seeing that higher turnout. So it's kind of the logic doesn't seem to make sense, but the higher partisan conflict that we have, the higher turnout is because, frankly, it engages more people. But as I said before, trust is essential in elections. You have to trust the election process to accept the results, which really gets at the legitimacy of our government, that you trust that the policies being proposed or legislated by the winners, they deserve to be in the position to get them. And Justice Stevens said in his decision in Crawford versus Marion County Election Board that public confidence is closely related to the state's interest in preventing voter fraud. Public confidence in the integrity of the electoral process has independent significance because it encourages citizens to participate in the democratic process. So we've got threats to our electoral trust. One of the things that I see, which is, I think, very clear in the wake of the 2020 election, is really a lack of constitutional understanding of how our national elections are run. Certainly the constitutional language that says that states are responsible for their own elections, but that the federal government can pass laws to change those things. There's certainly a misunderstanding of how the Electoral College works, or the purpose of the Electoral College even. And there is certainly almost no knowledge of the 1887 Electoral Count Act, which now we're having to go back and pay attention to in retrospect. But those are fundamental things that without an understanding of those, you have it's easy to think that your elections are being led off in different directions. I think we have one other threat to our elections as inaccurate counting. There's always been concern about computer hacking. Certainly that was the case after some of the states went to complete electronic voting. I think that Secretary Gardner, when he was Secretary of State in New Hampshire, really made a point of ensuring that we always had a paper trail that we could follow and have a physical ballot for each person. So that's another thing. And then there's always concerns about illegal voting, that people who are not residents of a state, who are non-citizens of the country, who vote in multiple states or at multiple times in the same states. These are always concerns. They tend to be very minor when you actually look at the numbers, but the threat is always there. And it's, again, the perception, I think, that's more important than the reality. Now I'll get back to what I really wanted to talk about, that long lead-in. The trust in New Hampshire elections is actually quite high. We asked questions going back to 2003 on some of our polls. We do this periodically. We asked people about how confident are they that their vote in the previous election was accurately counted. And in New Hampshire, the percent who said that they were either very confident or somewhat confident has stayed pretty stable. It was 85% in 2003, 83% in 2016, 84% just this summer. So you'd say, okay, well, that's good. Everybody's very confident in how our elections are counted. Well, not so fast. In 2003, 70% of Republicans were very confident their vote was counted accurately. 70%. In 2022, that was down to 29%. Significant drop. Looking at 40 percentage point drop there. In 2003, only 48% of Democrats thought that their vote was, they were very confident that the vote was counted accurately. That's up to 95% after the 2022 election. In both of those instances, there were people that were confident, largely because their party won, and there were people who were not confident, largely because their party lost. This cycle you see happen over and over. Pew has seen the same sort of thing happen in national polling as well. So it's important, in my view, that people from all parties think that are confident that their vote is counted accurately. And this is where I think we're still having a hangover from the last two elections. because we asked New Hampshire voters how confident are they that their 2022 election vote, so the November election, how confident are they that that vote will be counted accurately? Overall, 57% are very confident, another 22% are somewhat confident, some are still up at that 79%, 80%. But if you look at Democrats, among Democrats, it's 99%. You're either very or somewhat confident that the vote will be counted accurately. Among Republicans, that's only at 56%. The Republicans still are not confident that their vote, not as confident as Democrats, that their vote will be counted accurately. And I think this is a concern. It's a concern I think that will likely go away, but I think this is a concern that you as a committee need to hear because it is a perception. And it's not just a perception of some leaders of parties out there, it's into the psyche of voters. We also asked a series of questions about their confidence in different counting methods. Mechanical counting, manual counting, so counting by hand, optical scan counting, and then electronic machine counting. Most people are pretty confident in all of these. The one that there's the greatest amount of confidence is mechanical counting. That's followed by hand counting, then going down to OptiScans, and then to electronic machine counting. It's also important, though, that the major reason you're seeing this, I believe, is that most people in the state are using some sort of machine count. The hand count is the one that you have probably the least amount of people, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But what's important also, though, is if you look at that by-party breakdown, so 91% of Democrats are very confident that mechanical counting is accurate, only 63% of Republicans. 82% of Democrats are very confident that manual counting is accurate, only 63% of Republicans. Democrats, 81% say that optical scans, they're very confident in optical scans, only 57% of Republicans there. And then for electronic counting, 81% of Democrats say they're very confident, very or somewhat confident in that. That goes down to 48% for Republicans. So that same sort of pattern of mistrust is there regardless of the type of counting that's being done.
Yeah, question?
Sure.
Would you rather?
Actually, why don't we wait till the end of the presentation, then we'll do a question period at that time.
And as I mentioned, if you look at the towns that people live in by the type of, they're either in a town that's using a machine count or a hand count, the people in towns with hand counts are much less confident in their counting method than are people with machine counts. And you might say, well, they don't trust hand counting. I don't think it's so much that. You'll see this, I imagine, will come up. This is more of a looking at the dog that didn't bark sort of thing. This is highly correlated with party identification. The towns which are use hand counting are much more rural, small towns. Those also tend to be Republican towns. And the Democratic base is more in the bigger cities and towns that have some electronic machine counts. So that's there, the difference is there, but I think it's really partisanship, the same thing we was looking at earlier, rather than the type of machine that people are used to. Okay, so to move on from your own confidence in it, we asked about voter fraud. How serious of an issue do you think voter fraud is in New Hampshire? And we did this, we've done this going back to 2017. In 2017, 33% said that voter fraud in New Hampshire was either somewhat serious or very serious. By June of 2022, that's down to 22%. So we've seen an increase in confidence since the 2016 election. In fact, the percent who say that they think that's either not too serious or not serious at all has been over 70% since August of 2020. And again, that's somewhat misleading because if you ask people, if you look at that by party ID, you see a very different pattern. So in our most recent poll, this is from just this past June, among Democrats, only 2% believe that voter fraud was very serious or somewhat serious. Among Republicans, that was 39%. So that perception is there again, and it's a partisan perception. Now, when it comes to the U.S. as a whole, we see a much different perception of voter fraud. This is similar to the data that you get when asked about whether or not people trust Congress or if they trust their congressman. Nobody trusts Congress's people like their congressman. So we're seeing the same thing here. This is New Hampshire data again. Going back to November of 2017, 54% of people in New Hampshire believed that voter fraud in the U.S. was either somewhat or very serious. That's down to 47% now. It's dropped a little, but it's still pretty high. And 52% right now say it's not too serious or not serious at all. So that's still a concern, perception of voter fraud. And it's still partisan driven. And here you see it even to a greater extent than you did about asking about fraud in New Hampshire. Among Democrats, only 5% believe that voter fraud in the U.S. is either very serious or somewhat serious. Among Republicans, it's 88% believe that voter fraud is either very serious or somewhat serious. So it's two different worlds here. Two different worlds. I think that's maybe one of the reasons we're here today talking about these sorts of things. So fraud is not seen as a major issue in New Hampshire. There is a partisan distinction there. Fraud is considered to be a much more serious issue across the country. And I think that's largely because here in New Hampshire, we see who runs our elections. People know it's people in their town that run for office to run their elections. But the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the other things that can limit turnout, decrease trust in elections, is the ease of voting, the perceived ease of voting. And that's something that in New Hampshire, we think it's quite easy. 83% of people in New Hampshire said it was very easy for them to vote in the 2020 election. And this is pretty bipartisan. 90% of Democrats thought it was very easy to vote. 86% of Republicans. Only 2% of people overall said it was somewhat or very difficult to vote in the 2020 election. So getting to the polls and voting in New Hampshire is not the issue. It's the perception of the confidence that the vote is being counted accurately, and to some extent the perception of fraud in elections. So I just want to summarize the points I wanted to make today. Confidence in New Hampshire elections has been very high for the 2 decades that I've been looking at this. But that partisan divide is growing. Republicans have become less confident, and Democrats have become more confident that their votes are counted accurately. Part of that, I believe, is just the cheerleading effect or sore loser effect, depending on how you want to look at that. But that concern is there, and I think it's bleeding into our politics, and it's certainly the perception is at the national level that there is a problem with elections. There's really little concern about election fraud in New Hampshire, although that is higher among Republicans and Democrats. Concerns about election fraud in the U.S. is much higher, both among Republicans and Democrats, but especially among Republicans, and that voting is very easy in New Hampshire. So overall, getting back to when I was first talking about public opinion, it's not so much that there are real issues or real problems here in New Hampshire. I think that we have had a long history of examining our electoral process, trying to make it easy, trying to make it transparent. I think Secretary Gardner did an excellent job of making sure that we had a paper trail so we could track that, to prove to people, to show people that our elections were run in a straightforward way. But that perception among a fairly sizable minority of people in the state that things may not be as trustworthy is something to be concerned about. And I think that's a good reason to have these sorts of hearings to look into that and to assuage some of that, because I think the evidence for it is somewhat less. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now have questions from the committee, and I think the first is committee member Merrill. Mandy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I have
Be sure to speak into the mic so that we can record your comments.
Actually, I have 2, I think. One, I just was going back a bit. I was struck by the data on people's confidence in different methods of voting. and thinking, does everybody really know that much about different machines? Or is the overall effect just one of, hey, I'm confident about voting, and they're not differentiating among, or even between paper ballot, or between...
I think that is absolutely a lot to be said for that, especially when we asked about optical scan machines. I don't think people necessarily know what an optical scan machine is versus a different kind of machine. I think that people are looking at their own situation and responding that way. But I think even in a lot of towns, we don't know how our ballots are counted necessarily.
Maybe this is a question for the Secretary of State. It's a follow-up if I can. But in terms of what goes on in New Hampshire, I mean, we know there are little towns that use hand counting, and there are optical scanners. Are there, I don't even know, are there mechanical machines? Yeah. But 35% are very common. But
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I might, it's either hand count or use the AccuVote machine.
yeah.
There's no other option.
Yeah, thank you. The other question or just request, if you think there's time for you to do this briefly, is I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about methodology, which you give a brief description of, and I think this is what I have is what we will all be getting.
There's a change in the methodology that was used. Without boring people too much, the survey research world is going through a paradigm shift in how data are collected, largely driven by cost. The cost for us to do a statewide poll between 2016 and 2020 more than doubled. The reason for that is people don't answer their cell phone if they don't know the number there, so the number of times you have to call them has gone way up. If you look at national polls, national media organizations are getting now 5 to 7% response rates in their surveys, meaning that 95% or so of the household numbers that they call don't complete a survey. When I started doing this in the 1980s, we had response rates in the 85% range, much more confident. But the costs have led us to move to different types, different ways of collecting data. And COVID actually spurred us on at UNH. They closed down our survey center. We had to work from home. We had been experimenting with what's called probability-based panels. And a probability panel, which is what we use in this most recent survey, and what we've used pretty much exclusively since 2021, and even 2020, end of 2020. We randomly recruit people from across the state participate in a panel. We recruit them either by sending them a text at random to a randomly chosen cell phone number, to call them up at random and recruit them that way, or use what's called address-based sampling, which we send letters to randomly selected households and ask them to participate in a panel. We have about 7,500 people in our panel in New Hampshire now. We don't interview them all the time. Commissioner Cook's one of those people. He's spoiling the sauce there, I guess, a little bit. But we have about 7,500 people. We then take a random sample of that group for each one of our surveys because we don't want to burn them out, and we continually recruit people. This is the methodology that we've been developing. We've done quite a bit of research looking at how accurate that is. But the Gallup poll does that now. The Pew Center for the People and Press does this. And in the next few years, you'll see pretty much every major survey organization do this because it's simply too expensive to do telephone polling.
Just follow up. So how long do the panelists serve? That's the right way to put it.
We measured this. There's something, the statistics we use, it's called panel mortality. And when you say I've had enough of this, people tend to opt out themselves. And it's usually after about 6 months to 9 months. And then we'll recruit, but we continually recruit and replenish our panel. So some people really enjoy this and they've stayed on longer. Most people kind of get tired of it after a while. But there's something about expressing your opinion that's helpful.
Jim, you had
Yes, Andy. Thank you very much. Very good job that you've offered. I have two questions. One rather personal one and one for the committee. Did you come up from UNH today, and how long did it take you to get here?
Well, I don't drive as slow as you, and I took to the back roads. I got here in about an hour and 5 minutes.
Give me directions for getting back.
Route 107, beautiful ride, that's what I did.
It's a pretty ride.
My question for the committee. Dave Scanlon, when he appointed this committee a few months ago, gave us a specific mission. And we're not an election law committee. I don't expect we're going to be suggesting a lot of different changes in the way that elections are administered, because the election law committee meets hundreds of hours during legislative session deciding that. He wanted us to come up with ideas or suggestions on how to improve, enhance the confidence of how we vote in New Hampshire. Based on your polls, do you have any, maybe two specific suggestions? I heard you talk about a couple. You talked about improving the education, the Constitution, but we can't force people to do that. Do you have a couple of specific ways that Secretary of State's office or locally, city and town volunteers who work on elections can use to improve the voter confidence in our state?
I think one of the things that can be done locally, and this goes back to some of the training manuals that we worked on 20 years ago, is to invite people from towns to come in and see how it's done. Encourage them to work at elections. I know that it's very difficult to get volunteers often to work and serve at elections, but if you're there and you're doing it and seeing it, you can see that it's a fairly transparent process. And that, I think, would go a long way to try to reduce some of the suspicion that's out there. But the second thing, and this is a bigger issue, so I teach political science majors. I am often shocked or stunned or saddened by the lack of civic education that they have coming out of our high schools today. The understanding of the founding of the United States, or the idea of federalism and what federalism means, is something that people that I was speaking to in Europe have a much better handle on than many of my undergrads do out here in high school. That the reason that we have an electoral college is even not understood by people. The idea that states created the federal government, not the other way around, and that the states are not just administrative units of the federal government. So that basic understanding of the Constitution, why the Constitution is written the way it is, why certain powers are delegated to different branches of government, is something that I think if there was a little bit more sophisticated understanding of that, the ease of being convinced that there are nefarious things going on would be lessened. Part of the reason, and one of the major reasons that we have states administering elections, is that the states didn't trust the federal government to do it. They wanted to be in charge of something that they understood and they knew how to do already. That idea, I think, is not there anymore in a lot of America.
Thank you.
Yes, Doug.
Yeah, I'd like to go back a little bit to the trust issue, which I think is really the key to the whole thing. And you said something pretty profound. You said perceptions matter more than reality. Perceptions become reality. And I'm involved with the group Braver Angels. We had a workshop down in Boston about a month ago. And we had some partisans from both sides talking about elections to see if we could come to some common ground. And I could talk more about that. But what I wanted to focus on was a passing comment someone made that almost didn't attract a lot of attention. But I think it really spoke to some of the problem when someone said, people trust social media more than they do their neighbors. And I think this is where maybe you could talk a little, you've talked about what the problem, what are some of the causes here, and how do we, this is how we have to somehow find some ways to overcome this, although I agree with your suggestions. I think they're excellent, but they're sort of operating on the margins, it seems like.
Well, In today's world, we all have more access to information about our country, about our community, about the world than we've ever had in human history. We have so much more access to information, so many more news sources that we can get information from, that we should be incredibly well informed. That was the problem, one of the promises of the internet. The problem is, we also have a lot more kitten videos and sports channels and cooking shows, you name it, available on the internet, which frankly are more attractive to most people than the depressing stuff that's going on in the news, either in the United States or overseas. We consume less news today than our parents did. And they consumed less than their grandparents did. Using an example, if you watch the half-an-hour television news broadcast and you threw out the commercials and all the other fluff that's in that, you end up with about 2/3 of one page of a newspaper. 2/3 of one page. And many people, that's the only source of news that they get. What can you learn from 2/3 of one page of a newspaper? Yes, you have the ability to go and read 6 or 7 newspapers a day. A lot of it's the same stuff, but you can get things from a different perspective, but we don't do that. So to your point about social media's job is to keep you hooked on social media, to keep you watching it as much as possible. The same thing is true with cable television. You know, the news debate shows that they have are not there to actually have informative debates about policy or politics. It's to keep you watching through the commercial break. And that's what social media does. And so they feed you things that they think you want to hear. So you don't get any other alternative explanations. You don't get any other information. The things you're getting is tailored for your wants and desires. What can we do about that? I don't think there's any way you can legislate anything other than encourage people. Don't bother with your social media. Talk to your neighbor. It's a lot more informative, and you might get a dinner or a beer out of it rather than talking to somebody on social media, which is just going to make you angry.
Go ahead, Brad.
I don't want the headline that comes out of this to say that Professor Smith bans cat videos. What is the correlation, if any, that you found in polling over time between the constant accusations by the former president that he won the last election and the confidence level of the Republican Party?
Well, there are people that have looked at that specifically, and from their research, it has made a big difference. And you even go back to the 2015-2016 election season, during the primary up here, there was a concern about fake polls. Fake polls, fake news, you can't believe what's going on. There was an effort to dismiss the election outcome in 2016 before the election even happened. So I think that is a concern, and there is research that shows that there is a correlation between that, and certainly there's a hangover effect from that in the last 2 election cycles. Again, it doesn't matter if you can dismiss and disprove all of the allegations. It's the repetition of it that's there. And one thing I should say about that, because I pick on cable TV and social media a lot. Even with cable TV, the percentage of people that actually watch cable TV news, and it doesn't matter if it's Fox News or MSNBC, it's actually a very small percentage of the overall population of the U.S. Fox News averages around 4 to 5 million people a day watching that. It's probably the same people every day. And MSNBC and CNN, 1.5 million or so each. These are people who watch CNN and watch Fox News and watch MSNBC because they're political junkies. They're no different than the people who watch ESPN because they're sports junkies. This is what their habit is. But most other people don't even get that information. They're just hearing it from their neighbor who's repeating something that they said they heard on Fox News or on MSNBC, or on social media, copying an article that they saw on Fox or MSNBC and passing it on to their friends. So the spillover effect is there, it's real. Polling data are fairly clear about that. I think it's somewhat difficult to pull out that kind of sore loser syndrome that we've seen happen from both Republicans and Democrats. When you lose, the referee was obvious. In a football game, when you lose, because the referee was biased against you, they had all those bad calls. If you win, the calls were fine, they went evenly both ways. That same thing happens in politics.
I have a question, but I will preface it by saying, first of all, this is not for my own personal benefit, although it has to do with me personally. When I ran for the Senate, I was going into the election supposedly 8 points ahead of my opponent. I was on the exit polls called to be the winner 3 hours before they closed the ballot boxes. And I was called by the president and everybody in the cabinet before the election was even closed and the official count was in. Through that whole process, I understood the balance and where the votes were coming from in New Hampshire, and I asked everyone to please not jump to those conclusions, but I ended up losing by a point and a half. And against all of those prior information, I ended up the loser and had to accept defeat as a matter of course. As you have talked here with us today, you have talked about how these results ebb and flow. I would be curious to have you speak a little bit more about how you have seen that, because a lot of what you're giving us is up-to-the-minute information. But if you go back as far back as the mid-90s, to my experience, I think the perspective that you can bring to this could be very helpful for people to understand that, yes, right now, Republicans are not happy with how things went, but at a point in time in the past, they were happy with the results, and in a point, maybe in the not too distant future, as in this midterm election, they may be happy once again. So I'd be very curious to get a prediction from you as to how things are going to go this November, and whether or not this angst in the public is going to remain in the one-sided way that it currently stands.
Well, there have been 3 times in the last 100 years where the president's party gained seats in the House of Representatives. One was in 1934, just after the 1932 election where FDR won the presidency, and Democrats really consolidated that victory in 34. The second time was in 1998 in the wake of Bill Clinton's impeachment trial, with the stock market way up and people that took job approval for Clinton was way up. And the third time was in 2002 when we were still, when President Bush then had approval ratings in the 80% range, coming off attacks on 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. This year will be a bad year for Democrats. We've seen in 2006, Democrats went big when President Bush's job approval was down. We saw in 2010, Republicans won big because Obama's job approval was down and people were unhappy there. 2014, the same thing. 2018, we saw Democrats win because of Trump. Biden's job approval rating is lower than Trump's was at the time of the 2018 midterm elections. Granted, the country's become more and more gerrymandered in congressional districts and in states as well. This is basically, it's a bad environment for Democrats. So my sense is that after this election, Republicans will be much more confident in the outcomes of elections and the trust in the electoral outcomes than Democrats will be. Again, it goes back to, it wasn't that our team got beat, it was the referee must not have been fair. Somehow the game was rigged. And that's human nature, and I think that's one of the things that you see throughout. When I used to live in Wisconsin for a while, and there was a radio guy that I used to talk with about polling that we did there. And he had a saying that rationalization is the second strongest human drive. And I think in politics that is very, very true. In fact, many of you have been, all of you have been involved in politics. I'm sure you've heard of when you have a less than stellar candidate on your ticket. Now, he may be a skunk, but he's our skunk. He must be better than your skunk. That sort of thing is typical behavior in politics, and I think that we'll see this start to go away after the 2022 election, but it's just going to, it ebbs and flows, it comes and goes.
Ken, we haven't heard from you. No questions? Okay. I'm sorry, Doug, go ahead.
No, I would just like to thank you for your presentation and also for, you've been doing this for a long time. I don't know how many years, but I can remember back when I was in the legislature, which was a long time ago, you were at it, and I think the work you've done has really helped us in the state, so I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you, and I should say all of this is public. The presentation that I had for today, I'll give that to you and make that public. Feel free to do with that what you will. And we put all of our press releases up on our website so anybody can see all that information too.
And I want to echo Doug's words. We thank you very much for the time and for the preparation that you put into this presentation. I think that you've been very well qualified and very helpful in us understanding, and more importantly, you've offered a few suggestions which I'm sure will find their way into our report. But also just keep at it, and we hope that you can get in contact with as many people and students and others that you possibly can to give them the kind of perspective that you bring to this work. And so we thank you for all that you've done here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been my pleasure to actually prepare this for you.
Just a couple more lines to mention.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
before you leave,
And this is the question that I don't want.
now that you're into
The Columbo question.
predictions, do you think New Hampshire will be retaining the New Hampshire First Nation presidential primary in 2024? And did I read recently that there's some opinion that you've released about the attitudes of the New Hampshire voters on it, that you could just elucidate to us a little bit so we're aware of that?
I actually have, and it's somewhat troubling that support in New Hampshire for requiring that New Hampshire have the first presidential primary has been declining. In 2019, 61% of people in the state supported that. That's down to 55% now, and it's declined the most among Democrats, and now it's only 45% of Democrats support having New Hampshire being required to have the first primary. It's 65% of independents, 60% of Republicans. So there is I think that's a concern. New Hampshire has had the first primary in part because it's legislated, but we have the first primary not because we're really smarter or better or anything than other voters, but because
That may be one man's opinion.
but politicians think that it's important. And if politicians no longer think that the New Hampshire primary is important, they're the ones who are going to make the decision. We could be still first in the nation, but if nobody comes, that's a bigger issue.
So, follow up on Jim, so he's not the last question. It's not a sinner.
This is the last follow-up question.
Who knows?
I know.
I wondered if you thought that in terms of among New Hampshire citizens, if there's a relationship between longevity of residents in New Hampshire and how much they care about it being in New Hampshire.
It's an empirical question. I can look at that more specifically, but my sense is it's probably not as much. What we see with that is it is tended to be correlated with level of education and your habit of voting. And your habit of voting makes you more interested in politics. And remember, we have a really high percentage of turnout in presidential election years. We have high turnout in our presidential primaries, largely because there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on those elections here. You go to our off-year elections, turnout goes down pretty bad. And then if you get to town elections, turnout what, 15%, 20%, something like that. And what I tell students is, if you want to make a difference, you want to see a real difference in your life, your town elections is where that happens. You want to have a stoplight at that dangerous intersection down the street or not? Town can deal with that. But what happens in electing a president, yeah, that's important in the big picture, but it's not going to impact your life as much as what goes on in your own towns. So getting to the point about support for the primary, I think that gets back to the whole idea of the civic education that we have to have people understand what they can expect from government, why it's important to participate. If you think it's important to participate, or if you just think you do it because you're a political junkie, you participate. For other people, they shrug their shoulders. But we'd like to pride ourselves on being a state that can have the greatest access to presidential candidates in primaries, and we do. We get upwards of 20% of people in the state say that they have actually met a candidate or been to an event with a presidential candidate. That means 80% haven't. So you can if you want to, but most people just aren't that interested in politics. So to me, it's not a civic education. But then again, I'm a political science professor, so it's important to me. Probably not as important as kid videos.
Dave Scanlon has a job to do. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll now open the public comment part of our meeting. I need the sign-in sheet because that's what I'm going to use to call people to testify.
You can ignore me.
You've given your comments. Thank you. Now, I know that there's one individual here who wanted to speak last meeting and didn't get a chance to. And your name is?
Winslow.
Why don't we let you go first, and then we'll start at the top of the list and go down the list. Brad Winslow from Auburn, New Hampshire.
Help me follow along in the discussion.
Thank you.
So as a way of introduction, I was a resident of Windham during the whole debacle with the SB 43 debate. I pulled the documents from the Secretary of State's office and I've read them. And I went through a lot of that. The thing that concerns me, kind of brought my attention to it, and that's how I became interested in everything that's going on in the state. My background, I'm not a political scientist by any stretch of the imagination. I went to college at the University of Michigan. I have a bachelor's degree in naval architecture. I have a master's degree in marine hydrodynamics. I managed to work my way through my master's program by being a member of a team called the Computer Aided Ship Design Program. It was funded by the NSF. After school, I went out and worked in the CAD CAM industry in the late 70s, early 80s. After which I started a company with a friend of mine, and we did software for naval architects for about 6 or 7 years. He still runs the business. I had other life-changing events. And I went into working industry. I worked as a software developer, as it turns out, dealing with microprocessors, dealing with 8088s, very similar to the architecture in the Apple machine. I've done that for 20 years. I did a lot of color science work, several patents in color science. I did networking work in the industry, large-scale printers, small-scale printers, and pretty much have been geek my whole life. So I approached this as, everybody's been talking about what's going on in the system, what's going on in the state. So I decided I was going to take a look at this, and where do I start? I started on the web. So I started looking around to see what I could find for information. Has anybody ever done any kind of forensics on elections in the past? And I came across this guy, Professor White from UC Berkeley. And he was a Democrat, and he thought for sure that the Republicans were stealing the elections. So he came up with a set of tools to use as forensics to look at election results. And you can look at these things in a number of different ways, and I think the way that's most applicable to the elections that we've had in the state of New Hampshire is what I presented in this document here. So if you want to follow along with me, we can start from there. So the first thing that Professor White talks about is the law of large numbers, which is also called Bernoulli's law, if you're interested in the terminology. Before I get too carried away into this, I'd like to thank Doug for inviting me to the Braver Angels thing. I was on the red team over there. Not that I'm a Republican, registered undeclared. But I thought it was great that we had both sides of the coin to talk to each other, and it was a really interesting event, and I made some friends there. Back to the paper. So Bernoulli's law, or the law of large numbers, pretty much everybody knows if you flip a coin enough times, it's going to land on heads half the time and tails the other half of the time. But not right away. Right away you'll get some discrepancies and then you get more heads and tails. And so you do enough samples that it winds up being, you're reasonably close to the 50% mark. So I mean, everybody kind of understands that. That's kind of the way that the world works. So on page 3, there's a chart that shows there's some inconsistency at the beginning of the trial, and then eventually it settles out to be 50-50 heads and tails. Okay. And then we move on and talk about 2 coins. Sorry. I just think everybody sort of needs this background information in order to understand the analysis that follows on. So if you have 2 coins, one's weighted so it'll be heads 90% of the time, one's weighted so it'll be 50-50. If you flip those coins at the same time, 50%, 90%, you'll average at 70%. So if you look at the coin tosses, they in fact, they hover around for a while, and they settle out at 70%, which is what you would expect. So then it gets a little trickier. Well, what if you start flipping the 50-50 coin first, and then you introduce the 90-10 coin? Well, what happens in that case? Well, if you look at the chart that's on page 7, you'll see that it eventually arrives at 70%, but there's a slope in there where you're going from 50 to 70%. So then this is where Dr. White sort of gets into this, and I'm going to apologize for some of his terminology. He talks about hacking elections. I don't mean to imply that we're hacking our elections. I just want to talk about this in the way that he presented the article. And I can give you the web link, which is actually in this document. I'll provide you with an electronic copy of this document. So he talks about what happens with election results. Now, if you could monitor an election during the process, which we can't, we don't do that. We start the election, then we finish the election, and we look at the results. But how can you do that? So he sort of talks about precinct size. You're dealing in a small precinct, fewer votes, and you tend not to sort of fool with that, right? But as the precinct sizes increase, you wind up converging to a number, right? Whatever the percentage is, or whatever the pollster predicted it was, you eventually wind up at some answer, right? This guy got 45% of the vote, this guy got 55% of the vote. And that's the way it works, right? You go on forever until you count the whole state out. That isn't likely to change much by the time you get to the end of the count, because you've got a body of votes that's so large that the number of votes you're going to add to it relatively small, but it will change. Okay, and then typically, by the time you get to 1,000 votes, you're pretty sure where the answers are going to lie. So then, Dr. White says, well, what if I wanted to hack an election? What do I do to hack an election? He says, well, says you have to pay attention to a couple of things, right? Because people monitor elections. Good election monitoring, I think, in this state. People are careful. People watch the polls. People watch the machines. Okay? And so you're not going to go after the small precincts, right? You're not going to want to add and subtract votes because people are going to monitor that kind of stuff. So the only real solution if you're going to hack an election would be to flip votes. So you want to move votes from candidate A to candidate B. So that's kind of what happens, right? So how do you do it? You don't want to play with the small precincts because people look at those numbers and say, well, if I'm going to change 20 votes and there's only 200 votes in the precinct, well, people are going to get aware of that and they get nervous, right? So, and it isn't going to help you much if you have to get thousands of votes to change the outcome of an election. So they say you should leave those things alone. What you should do is you go after the larger precincts and you basically flip votes of those, and that's how you acquire enough votes to change the election. So that's kind of where Dr. White comes in and says, well, That's the kinds of things that I have to look for. If I'm going to do an audit on an election, I need to look to see, where could this happen? Where could people change vote? I'm not saying that that's something that happened here. What I'm saying is that what I found looking at the data are some anomalies in the tallies on the machines, and that's what I want to bring your attention to. So if you look at page 11, so this is a graph of what you would expect in sort of a normal election. You'd find, as you start counting the smaller precincts, then maybe they lean more to the right, maybe some lean more to the left. But you're going to get some noise in the early parts of an election. So you start counting up the precincts and you start acquiring a large number of votes. Then you'll find these two lines will converge and you'll get the final result of an election. And you would consider this to be a fair election if you were to look at this graph. Things converge onto a particular number, some percentage, which would be expected. However, if people are starting to look at an election and you get a graph, you have the lines crossing, where one candidate is continually rising and other candidates continuing falling, well, that's an indication that some of the votes may have been flipped. Right? Somehow this guy got more votes stuff. So in Windham, there are 4 AccuVote machines, 4 electronic voting machines. And what we have, so in the graph, and I'd be happy to share this with anybody that's curious, we have overall party affiliation, the mail-in affiliation, and we have the walk-in affiliation. And in Windham, it's a pretty red town. 53% of the overall affiliation is red, 34% is blue. And there's some 13% that are relatively undecided, which would be me. I would be in the undecided category. I don't really have a horse in this race, except that I'm curious as to how these statistics play out. So 3 of the machines are in agreement. So they would say that Mr. Biden got 40% of the vote and Mr. Trump got 57% of the vote. 3 of the machines agree quite consistently, which is what you expect from the law of large numbers. You've got basically 3 samples going to these things and you're getting the same result. Makes sense, right? One machine doesn't. One machine doesn't behave according to that law. It comes up with a different set of numbers, and that's machine number 2 in this case. And why is that? Well, I don't know. I don't know why that is. But if you look at the poll results of, say, 40 to 57, there's a 17-point gap there between the 2 candidates. However, on machine 2, it's 56 for Mr. Biden and 42 for Mr. Trump. It's a flip back and forth between the 2 candidates. And in Windham, there are about 10,000 votes. So 100 people represent 1% of the vote. So looking at the final combined output of 45 for Mr. Biden and 52 for Mr. Trump, we see that we've lost 10 points in that swing. So 10 points, that would be 5 points for each candidate, basically accounts for 500 votes. So I'm saying, well, how did that happen? I don't know how that happened. All I know is it's different and it doesn't obey the law of large numbers. I have an issue. I'd be more than happy to hear how we could possibly run that. And the 3 machines all agree. They're all very close to each other. They certainly all agree within one signal. They represent 67% of the population, which is considered a reasonable population. So I'm curious, and I don't know. But then I did the thought experiment. So what if I turn those 500 rows around on machine 2? What happens? That brings us off to page 15, where I moved 500 votes from Mr. Biden's column to Mr. Trump's column, and lo and behold, the percentages come out to match the other 3 machines. And then on page 16, you can see the graph between the official results, what we refer to as the hacked results, versus the unhacked results, which would be where I actually moved 500 votes from one candidate to the other, and then all 4 machines are in agreement. Now, what is even more puzzling to me is Merrill. Merrill has 3 wards, and 3 machines in each ward. One machine in each ward has a significantly different outcome than the other two machines in each poll. Now, I don't know how I get there. I'm looking at the party affiliations, and Merrimack's pretty much, maybe a slightly better town, but not terribly so. But I'm looking at 70%. And in the overall party affiliations, there's no group that is 70%. You know, the overall is 41% for blue. The walk-in was 36% for blue, and the mailing was 52% for blue. I don't know how I get to 70% on 3 different machines. If I look at the other 6 machines in Merrimack, they're all in agreement. Okay? They all are roughly 42 to 55%, more or less. Okay? So there's an agreement with those machines. Why they disagree with the other 3 machines, I don't know. I'm curious. In Merrimack, there's about 16,000 voters, so 160 voters for a percentage point difference. I calculate about a 9.5 percentage point difference, which would be about 1,550 votes. So I'm looking at Merrimack, you know, that's 10% of the votes that either aren't being accounted properly or somehow we violated the law of large numbers here. I don't understand it, so I'm asking for your help. Somebody can explain how that works to me. So I did the math, you know, I looked at what the appropriate percentages are by looking at the mean of what I believe to be the correct machines that didn't seem to have this counting problem. And I reworked the numbers the same way I've done for Windham. And you see the 2 charts, the official chart, and then the corrected chart where everything appears to agree. And on page 20, this is the document that we used to gather this information, along with some of the information that was in SB 46. So I think one of the reasons people have trouble, or at least what I have trouble with, is my sense of overconfidence, is that I can't explain that. I can't explain what happened at Merrimack, and I can't explain what happened in Windham. And I don't know.
So we, first of all, appreciate you bringing this information before the committee. No one else has looked at these machines in the same way that you have, so it is a new way of showing how the machines have differed on their accounts. The first thing that comes into my mind is, did you look at which machine was being fed the absentee ballots versus all the other straight voting ballots? Because my gut reaction is that those were the machines that were receiving the absentee ballots because the Democratic votes were greater in the absentees than they were on the Republican side. So that's one quick thought that comes to my mind.
I did look at that. In Windham, the ballots were fed equally across the machines. So I'm aware of, in the Windham case, the absentee ballots.
Okay. So
The Merrimack case, I'm not sure, but even if you took all the mail-in ballots and you fed them through the machines in Merrimack, how do you get to 70% if the mail-in ballots are only at 52%?
I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's a valid question to examine, and we will try and do what analysis and investigation that we can to incorporate your concerns. And I think that's the purpose of the committee, is to try and answer those questions. So we thank you for bringing them up. Are there any questions from the committee? Yes, Jim?
Yes, did you talk with any of the volunteers who worked on those polls on election day? Because my experience is that, and this is just another possibility in addition to what the good chair just offered, my experience is that people who are working on election day tend to be ready, the ballot clerks and the people working at the polls, to send people to different machines. And if I'm a Democrat who happens to know a number of Democrats checking in, I might favor 2 or 3 specific machines, regardless of the others being open, and say, okay, you can use this machine, you can use that machine. So that accounts for some disparity. as opposed to people just systematically, as flipping a coin, choose A, B, C, D, E, or whatever. So did you talk with the officials, the people who worked at the polls and ask them,
No,
what do they think?
I didn't do that. I just looked at the data that was available in this document. And I will say that if you look across the state, you will find this behavior throughout the state.
Behavior of the people at the polls
Having an anomaly
machines.
in the machines. Right?
Okay.
I mean, even if you directed all of the people with the mail-in ballots to certain machines, I don't think you would come up with enough of the other votes to come out to that percentages.
I wasn't talking about mail-in ballots, I was talking about people coming in the line, and the person who is assigning people to certain machines, they tend to favor certain machines, they're standing in a certain area. But if you talk with the people at the polls, maybe my suggestion would be that you've done some incredible work here, this is commendable, but maybe to complete the task, you could contact Merrimack and Windham city clerks, town clerks, and ask who was working on those days, and get an idea from them, some of them, as to how they assign people to go to different machines. And that might be an illustration of disparity, or perhaps that is something the good city,
But
the
even
good staff.
the walk-in at only 36%, I'm not sure how you would get to those numbers.
Thank you.
That's a difficult question.
Thank you. Any other, yes, Ken?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that I don't believe all the mail-in ballots. I live in Windham myself, and I've spoken with people who work the elections. I don't believe that all of the mail-in ballots were equally distributed throughout all the machines, but they were distributed across all the machines. So I wanted to make that clear.
Okay.
And I think, from what you've said, that even if that were the case, I think you still bring up a valid point as to, there's still a question as to how the discrepancy on machine number 2 could be so greatly different from the other machines. And if you look at Harry Hursty's documentary, latest documentary came out, I believe, last year. Harry was one of the auditors in the Windham audit, and Philip Stark was also an auditor. They're both in this movie, and they're talking about an election in Georgia, and they're talking about an anomaly like this that Brad's bringing up. And when they did similar mathematical, statistical analysis of the different types of machines, they went through and they ran through 10,000 different calculations, and they came up with the likelihood that this type of anomaly would show up was 1 in a million. So the fact that, Brad's bringing this up and it's happened across multiple machines, I think it is something that, is valid and something that should be looked at.
And I would probably recommend trying to run some forensics like this throughout the state and finding out if this is really a systemic problem or not.
Any other questions from the committee? We thank you very much for this. We have this information. We'll be getting back to you as a committee. We will need to look at this more closely, but you've brought an important issue before us, and I think that it needs to be addressed responsibly. So we thank you for that. I will say, in the interest of everybody having an opportunity to speak, we are somewhat limited on time. We're supposed to be concluding the hearing at 4:30, so that calculates on my watch and calculator to about 10 minutes per presentation for the remaining 11 presentations that we have. So we'll try and get everybody in if we possibly can. And that also means that in the past, anyone who has spoken at prior meetings, we ask that you wait till after all the people who have not spoken before the hearing, before the special committee, get their opportunity to speak before you come for a second opportunity or a third time. So thank you, Brad, and we'll excuse you and call Daniel Werman from Campton.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. I was a poll challenger in Campton. for the presidential election. And I was very displeased because I was not allowed to do my job, fulfill my responsibilities. I want to read a letter that I sent to the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Governor, and Stephen Stepnick, head of the GOP. But first, I just want to tell you, it was during COVID, and nobody knew what they were doing. Everybody was doing things wrong. We held our election in a gymnasium, and they actually roped off a little section in the corner, the farthest away from the ballot box, and pretty far away from all the other tables where you check in and get your ballot. My responsibility was to be right next to the poll workers, to hear the person's name that comes in to get a ballot, hear the address, where they live, the whole bit, and possibly look over their shoulder and look at the ID, among many other things. I was not allowed to leave my little corner of the room. That prevented me from doing any of my responsibilities. I could not see anything, couldn't hear anything, couldn't check anything. I did call up Secretary of State's office, the Attorney General's office, Governor's office, and Stepnick's office. And I was told exactly the same thing. Just we could put quotes right around it. They all told me shut up and sit down, with the exception of Stepnick's office. I was told shut up, sit down, and do my job. So I just want to read you, and another thing too is I have the letter saying I'm a poll challenger, and some numbers to call if I see anything or have any problem. All right, so I did do that and got a very bad response. So I'd like to read you the letter real quick here that I sent out to everybody. I said, during the 2020 elections, I was a poll challenger for the town of Camden. There's a roped off section in the corner of the room, and I had to remain behind that rope because I was not able to do or allowed to do my duties as a challenger. I was too far away to hear the names, addresses, check IDs, or anything else. I was not allowed into the building until after the machine was zero. And I was outside waiting, and I told them I wanted to be there to see it. They would not allow me to. I was not allowed to start to check the tape, make sure it was at zero. I wasn't allowed to look at the machine to see if it was at zero. So I don't know what it actually started at. And I don't know if there's any ballots in the box yet or not. So when I asked for all this, I was denied by the moderator and the town clerk, both. The closest I could get to any of the 5 registration tables was approximately 20 feet, and the farthest was about 45 feet. I was not able to verify even one voter's ID. And I did see about 160 people on that day come in with no ID and swear that they would like to be, or they are, a resident of the town. And they were all given a ballot to vote. I wasn't able to see or hear any of their names, check anything on them. And most of them did not have a driver's license or anything else. Just sign a name on an affidavit. I did
I'm sorry to interrupt, but were they signed their name? Was a picture taken of them? Were their ID credentials verified as a follow-up after the election? Those are the 3 things that I've been in that position. I've done those things in my town, and we've always been able to verify and authenticate whoever came in and did same day voter registration. Was that something that Camden did?
No, sir.
Okay.
There was no, well, I can't say there was none because I wasn't over there. There might have been a handful of people that did have an ID.
But you did not either. You didn't check with the officials to see if they had done the follow-up to check?
Yes, I did.
You did?
They did not follow up on not even one. None of them were followed up on.
Okay, thank you.
I did not see a camera, not saying they didn't do it, because I wasn't close enough. And most of them, they just came in, they talked, nobody reached for a pocket to pull out any ID, nobody had any in their hand, and they were just given a piece of paper, they signed their name, and they were handed a ballot box. I mean, a ballot.
Okay.
I called the Attorney General's office and Secretary of State, and Steve Stepnick, who's the chair of the GOP. They told me the same thing, shut up and sit down. I also called the governor's office, and no one even answered the phone. Somebody did get back to me later that night, but same thing, nothing we can do about it. When the votes were counted at the end, I was not even allowed to see the tape then to see what the total was. So not at the beginning, not at the end. One other person was also with me after the voting ended. And they were counting the hand votes. We were allowed to move a little closer, but we were not allowed to see or hear anything. We were at least 25 feet away while they were counting the hand votes. The total numbers did not add up properly. We were told there was no write-ins, and we said that's a lie, because both of us that were looking at it, watching them
You
count.
saw names written in on the ballot.
I did it. There had to be at least one. There was none. When I questioned it, it's like, oh, yeah, here they are. It screams fraud. You can't make a mistake that big because that's what they were doing, checking write-ins. And it took about 20 minutes.
We're trying to build voter confidence. What are the solutions to these problems that you encountered that you think would be best applied in our report so that in the future you would not have this feeling of being kept from observing properly and others would be in the same position?
Let people do their jobs. I was prevented with the threat of being arrested.
Did Camden have a document that showed what you were allowed to be able to do, that you could, no, but when did you receive those letters?
The people in Camden have been doing it for years. They know how it works.
Okay.
Supposedly, the same letters I have was sent to them. And they did know that I was a challenger. And they did know I was supposed to check everything beforehand and afterwards. They just didn't want me to do it. And when I was told, this is another thing, the clerk told me they zeroed the machine the day before.
So we have obviously elections coming up that we want to make sure the same mistakes aren't made, whether intentional or by error.
Right.
Those are the things that we're interested in having you address for us or with us, because that's going to have the biggest impact on you and people like you who are challengers at the polls.
My advice was talk to the Secretary of State, even the Attorney General if you want. Get yourself a copy of my duties, responsibilities, job description, however you want to call it. And then you'll know the answer to your question. What you should do is allow the challenger to do their job, which means they float around, they do not talk to the voters, they don't help the voters, but they can go. We had 5 tables, A through G and a G, and 1 long table for same-day voting. We also had the ballot box for people to drop it off, which was not manned. So the drop boxes should be manned. The challengers should be able to roam around and do their job and hear everything, because it's a small town again. There's only 3,200 people. I at least recognize most of them by face. So if John Smith comes in and say, hey, I'm Harry Jones, I know it. Okay, stop. I challenge it. Come over here, let's do this. He does not get the vote until we straighten it out.
What I'm hearing you say also, excuse me for interrupting, but I'm hearing you say also that there was no one that was supporting the documentation that defined your rights as a poll challenger.
That is correct. I approached them about it, the moderator and the clerk, because they ran like Gestapo. They told me they will have me removed from the premises and arrested if I keep going. They don't have that authority. And the police don't have that authority. All they're there for is to keep the peace if something happens. They have no jurisdiction to do anything related to votes. Now the sheriff does. I called up the sheriff. I told him, I'm in the corner, I can't do my job. Send a deputy up here and do something about it. I don't have time to do frivolous stuff. So the legalities is a big thing, and that's what we got to do. Let everybody do their job.
Are there any other questions from the committee?
I'm not done yet.
Well,
I still got another 3 minutes by my mentality.
in the interest of time, we are
So we had,
ready to move on to the next.
we have a town with 3,291 population. Registered voters, 2,957. That means there's 334 citizens of town not registered to vote. Now, that's anybody who just didn't register, new people who didn't do it, old people who don't care, children under 18 years old. That's assuming every child 18 and over is registered. So that's 334. If you add the children into it, population down, it's 402 children, ages 5 and up. 402 children is a lot more than 334 citizens that are not registered. Follow them or am I confusing you? 3,300 residents, 2,900 are registered. If you subtract that, you come up with 334 citizens not registered.
Where are you getting these numbers
From the town, from their books, and I went to the Keeper to Vote registration list. And I got the numbers from her. The one number was crossed off 3 times to come up with a number that even got close to make that work, so it was fudged. So we have 334 citizens not registered. If you take just the children registered in school, that's from the pre-K, 5 years old and up, 402. So that's 68 people that are registered that don't exist. And when you break it all down, all the numbers, I have all the percentages, if anybody wants it, it's available. There's 231 votes that were cast over the number of registered voters that were able to do it. When I brought this to the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, he didn't want to hear about it. They would not follow up on it. The governor wouldn't even take it. The people who answer his phone, I'm not bringing this to him. So there's something definitely broken. And it starts, I'm sorry, but at the Secretary of State's office, they're responsible for counting the votes. I called them, they were 40 votes off from what the town said we had votes.
But I'm familiar with Campton, I'm familiar with the small size of the community. The town list, you should be able to identify every single person and have a name and a check mark by their name as to whether they're registered to vote or not. You're picking numbers off of...
From town records when I did that, it's public knowledge. I went in, I said, give me the numbers, they gave them to me. This is what I'm telling you. They don't add up. Secretary of State's office, when I called them, they were 40 votes off from their tally. So there's a big discrepancy there.
So there needs to be consistency in the reporting.
No, we have to count proper. 2 + 2 is 4, not 7.
But that's, I think we're saying the same thing.
But when you count the votes, whether by machine or by hand, if it comes up with 206 votes, it should be 206. A little bit of error, which give 1%, that's 2.5 votes off.
Right,
Not 40.
I understand. I'm just trying to get to the nub of what it is that we need to put in the report that addresses your concern. And that is that the accuracy of the vote counting and the tallying of the registered voters to that count, to those votes, is something that needs to be transparent and consistent.
And integrity.
That's...
I saw boxes being stuffed with ballots that came out of thin air. I saw people who were registered voters coming up, didn't want to wear a mask for whatever reason. They were told to go around the side, come in a side door. They're handed a ballot at that door. They're supposed to go up, put it in the box, and then leave the same way. They were not allowed to. They did the ballot, they handed it to the town clerk. The town clerk took it and put it in the box. There's no following the ballots and there's no paper trail. When I called the Secretary of State's office, I said, can you go check the ballots and just recount them? They don't have them. The town has them. So I went to the town. They don't have them. Secretary of State has them. I asked both offices, where's the paper trail? Who signed for it, when and where? Neither one of them had it. So, I'm sorry, I don't have filter. There's fraud, there's discrepancy, the town is illegal, the town is corrupt. We need some investigation. The town clerk is responsible with nobody, neither is the moderator. I called up Secretary of State's office, and I hope you remember, because you did, for your office, call the town, and so did the Attorney General. Didn't get anywhere, though. All I did was say, hey, do your job, a little slap on the wrist, that's it. So there has to be, even if it's arrests, something has to be done to prevent the fraud. And I also already put our town police department on notice. I will have them arrested if it goes through the same thing. I will arrest a cop for preventing me from doing my job. I will arrest the town clerk, and I will arrest the moderator. The sheriff's department has to do it, or I'll bring them up on charges. It's their responsibility. So it really is getting out of hand. It's not just one or two towns, it's not Windham, it's not Merrimack, it's the entire state. And if it's this state that's doing it, I'm sure it's the entire United States. So the Secretary of State has to do their job, right on down to local, voting the municipality.
Thank you for your testimony.
Was there
Thank you.
just
Yes.
a couple questions.
Go ahead.
Was there a Democrat? I assume you were a Republican, John.
I am Republican, and everyone
No, I assume in this election you were...
everyone working the town at that time, the moderator,
This, but let me ask.
sorry,
Okay. Was there a Democratic challenge?
no.
So you were the only challenge?
Well, there's two. I did like 2/3 of the day, and then somebody else did the other
Okay, but
third.
there were two. Yeah, all right. That was my question. All right, that's it.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Ken?
I just have a brief question. I missed the town that you're from.
Campton, C-A-M-P-T-O-N.
Captain?
Thank you. Of all you described, I guess the sharpest visual image that came out of it, is the idea that you saw people actually stuffing ballots into the box out of thin air, I think you said. Did others there witness it, or was there any coverage?
I have it on film.
So,
That should be good enough.
I apologize if there was coverage that I missed, but
Right.
was there any media coverage?
No.
So when you say they stuffed ballot boxes, they were putting multiple numbers of ballots in that were not the absentee ballots that had been accumulated that needed to be fed in a group.
That's correct.
And you know that for a fact?
I asked them, yes.
And they said they're stuffing the ballots?
All the absentees, I watched them, they put them in, like during a little lull in the action, a little break, early morning. They put all the absentees in, or the mail-ins. And then the box was middle of the afternoon, I think, they didn't brought it in. And then probably 5 to 5:30, they came out, the town clerk came out with about 8 inches thick of ballots and ran them one by one through it after the box was already emptied and the write-ins were already done. And the box, if it had any more after that, was tallied just before the vote. So where did they come in with 8 inches of ballots and just stick them in after they were all counted?
Are there any more questions from the committee? Thank you very much for your testimony. We have it on record. Next is Linda Molinaro, also from Campton.
Thank you for hearing my testimony today. I'm going to go over a couple of things here. For me, it's definitely, I don't have confidence in our elections, and part of it is because it's unconstitutional, for one thing, for our state to even have machines. And if you wouldn't mind passing these out so that in here, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask, as he passes them out, if you could just initial that you received one. This here, what he's passing out is a remonstrance and a notice that I I am going to submit as an infringement on constitutional rights, because it's unconstitutional use of electronic voting machines according to our New Hampshire Constitution. And there's RSAs listed, there's articles listed, and so forth in other cases. And I've signed the back, that's number one. Also, if you look up on a site called votersunite.org, it literally says in several areas here that New Hampshire, there's a lot of anomalies. Like in 2004, a couple times there was a recount showed 234 fewer votes for a state senate race than in the initial count. In Concord, there was a recount of one state house race, showed 36 fewer votes than the original count. 2 hand count towns reported 0 votes for candidate Ron Paul to the media, even though they did have votes for him. Citizens can register at the polls, and anyone can provide proof of residence, can sign an affidavit promising that he or she lives there. And voters who sign the affidavit can vote, and they're not checked on. So, and then there's late counting. This was in Hollis in 2004 as well. And also Hanover, Exeter, Nashua, and Manchester counties. There were problems with the premier Diebold optical scan machines reported by the officials in all 4 counties. That breakdown of the visor that guides write-in votes into the right bin, and memory card failures. Also in 2008, Salem, there was a faulty keyboard interfered with the entry of votes collected in the precincts, causing votes to be misentered and an incorrect outcome to be reported initially. Let's see, 2004, reports of college students being discouraged from registering by local officials in a host of college towns. In Wolfboro, several residents with Kerry and Edwards signs in their yards found roofing nails in their driveways the morning of the election. And then that's what I've come up with there. Now, I worked the presidential primary in Plymouth I had a table outside under a tent, and I witnessed numerous busloads of young people with blacked out windows on these buses being handed bag lunches, box lunches. On the sides of the vans and the buses were Antifa, BLM. They were piling off. They were going inside the polls.
Do you have pictures, video of these buses?
No, because my phone didn't record at the time. But I did go in and I asked to speak to the moderator, and he made a big scene in front of these people. He chased me out, said I had no right to ask. So I went back outside, and because these young people saw what happened, they came up to my table and they tipped it over and practically assaulted me. And I called the police, and they were gone by the time the police came, and there was nothing that they could do. I was told by the moderator that these students were from Plymouth State University and that they were being bused in. Well, I have a friend who works in the shuttle bus for Plymouth State. He said he shuttled them all day, and several other people on their shuttles. There were no other buses from Pennsylvania, New York, and Vermont that they know of that were handing out any kind of lunches to people with blacked out windows. So that's one thing that really bothered me. So when Campton's presidential election came around, I went, this is what happened. I noticed cars, and I had pictures of those cars from Wyoming and Connecticut coming in and voting. I wasn't inside when they voted, but I did take pictures. I do have those on my phone. I did write in some votes on those ballots, and I was told that when they were counted, there were no write-ins. And then they said, like he said recently, that they suddenly found them. I feel like my rights were violated because I have a mask exemption from the VA, and I was told with this cane to walk completely around the building to the back door. They asked for my ID, and I held it up, and they didn't even look at it. They ran and handed me a ballot, the tax clerk did, and I said, what about checking off? Oh, I'll check it off for you. I'll check your name off for you. I never saw that my name was checked off. I was ushered into a little corner, one little area for people that can't wear masks, and then the ballot was taken from me. I couldn't even put it through the machine, and I was bum rushed out the back door again. And I wasn't allowed to use the restroom while I was in there. And I'm sorry, I've got disabilities, so those rights were violated.
So what are the things that you think should be done to change the system so that your confidence in the voting process is improved?
Well, you know, I think there's numerous things. For instance, I think I should be able to see my name being checked off. If there's ever another time with a pandemic that I have to be segregated from the rest of the people, that I should be able to see that somebody identified me, asked me where I lived and my address, and checked my name off. That's number one. Number two, there's got to be something done for people with disabilities. Instead of making them go completely around the building where, you know, healthy people could go in the front door and walk in 10 steps to vote, and I had to go completely around the back. I asked to use the bathroom. They said, no, you can't use the bathroom. And then I had to go all the way out the back door again and around the building to my car. So that is ridiculous. And the other thing too that I have a discrepancy over is the districting that we're doing. I see that in North Carolina, they said that they're not allowed to, the judges are not allowed to make the districting maps. It's through the legislature. This is by the Supreme Court. And I want to know how that's going to affect us, since Governor Sununu vetoed the legislature's recommendations for the districting. And now with this Supreme Court case, he's not allowed to do that. It's the legislature that has to do the districting maps. And I want to know why he vetoed it and how he got away with having the judicial branch decide what's right and wrong for the districting. But I'm just, I'm kind of, you know, I don't have any confidence. Not after the things I've seen, not after how I was treated. There's just no words that I can express that I had absolutely zip confidence.
Right, and we want to know what steps can be taken that starts to build back.
Well, accountability with the people who are running these elections in these towns. They need accountability of when they're doing something like this and taking my ballot, not letting me put it through the machine, when they're not checking off my name in front of me. Kind of, you know, dismissing the fact that because I'm known in the town, I'm a delegate, you know, just dismissing me as, you know, fodder, you know, just get out, you're bothering us. You know, I just, and then seeing what I saw in Plymouth and almost being assaulted, there's something that has to be done, some kind of accountability. And I don't believe that all the people that went into the Plymouth polls were actually students from Plymouth State, not after seeing blacked out windows and seeing all of these other, and in our town, I have the pictures of Wyoming cars and Connecticut cars and so forth. There's just, I don't know what to say, you know, they're not fixing it around the country. I don't know what to say here, so.
We are not fixing it around the country either.
Right.
We're focusing on New Hampshire.
Right, but if there was a solution somewhere else, we could implement it here, but I don't know. I hope that you guys can come up with something.
We are trying our best. And thank you very much.
Oh, and one more quick thing. I was a veteran overseas, and one thing too that I've noticed more recently is I had to send in absentee ballots when I was overseas by a certain date so that it would be counted by election day. If it didn't arrive in time, so be it. It was on me, my responsibility, to get it in the mail on time. And I just want to see that. I want to see that again, because stretching out the election for weeks on end to count these absentee ballots when the person themselves has the personal responsibility to get it to the place on time. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure.
Just what it's relevant for, but why did you have a table at the Plymouth election site?
Well, I had a table there, I was manning a table for Take Back New Hampshire group, which is helping people to get out and vote, helping candidates who need our help with door knocking, signage, anything like that. And it was just an information table, basically. Yeah,
Thank you very
Just
much.
wondered.
you're welcome.
Next, we will hear from Nancy Cunning, Lincoln, New Hampshire.
Yes. Well, I'm basically going to make mine short since there are many people here who want to be heard.
We all appreciate that.
All right. And the bottom line is you're looking for solutions. So I suggest you get rid of the voting machine. And I was very involved with your testimony. Are you familiar with Brenda Town? Is Brenda Town, did she? Yes, are you familiar? Okay, she has done a 2-year research on the machine. And also Maryland.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I missed your name.
oh, Nancy Honey.
Nancy Brown, okay, thank you.
From Lincoln.
Thank you.
And also, are you familiar with Marilyn Todd, who's done canvassing, and she's from the voter integrity group?
She
of New
also
Hampshire.
testified.
All right, so
in
these
their-
people have been researching for the last 2 years.
Yes.
You can, research them and see what they've come up with. So my solution is, the machines are illegal, and you need to get rid of the machines. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Any questions from the committee? Hearing
She gets a
none.
gold star for president.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We will next hear from Kathleen Powers from Laconia, New Hampshire.
I'll probably be even shorter than Nancy because I'm basically doing the same thing. I just want to support the fact we want to get rid of the machines. And that's it. I think that's a good solution.
You just say your name to the record, please.
Kathleen Powers.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, go right ahead.
I mean, when I go back to the 2020 election results and, people were counting for days, and one of the traditions or policies we've always had in New Hampshire is we count the same day. The ballot's going to be there, we're going to count it, and we're going to have, people are going to stay there until the results are in. And when I hear people advocating, are you concerned that if we get rid of the machines, it's going to just drag the counting out? It's going to take a lot longer. I mean, I live in a small town, we do hand count, but I just wonder if you have any concerns about that, about not having the results the same day.
Well, I know recently Laconia discovered 100-something ballots that were not counted. And so I'm concerned that, if these ballots were there beforehand, why weren't they included? Whether they were done previously or during that day, why were they hidden or, So that's kind of where I'm going with that. But didn't need to repeat all of that information.
No, we appreciate that. We hear from both of you, and thank you very much.
Just a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Since you were so quick.
Oh, yeah.
It's my understanding that whether you have voting machines or you do ballots by hand is a local decision, just like all of the administrative affairs running an election. So have you gone to the Laconia City Council to ask
I
them to
personally
change
have
the
not.
requirement?
No, I have not personally done that myself. I have only, in the last, say, 6 months, gotten more involved in some of the politics and actually done some research and watched some documentaries on our voting integrity. So that is where I'm coming from. I'm fairly new at it. That's why I didn't want to take a lot of your time, because I think people are saying pretty much the same thing.
So a number of communities have
Yeah.
done that,
Yeah.
and you might want to consider that too.
But I mean, if they need more people to help count, you can always ask. I think there's plenty of people out there that would be more than happy to help out with that. So say if it was you in that office that day, you weren't there 12 hours.
So we could call in the National Guard. Why don't we use the National
But
Guard?
it is a local decision, that's all I'm asking.
Yeah, and I
It is
am a
local
veteran as
decision,
well,
so you might ask.
disabled veteran. So, I find that much, our voice needs to be heard, especially in Laconia, because there's not a lot of veteran things available.
And we have your email address, so we can send you, I was also going to suggest that we send you a copy of Andy Smith's full report, because in his presentation, he talks about hand counting versus machine counting, and if I heard him correctly, polls show that people are more in favor of machine counting than they are in hand counting. So, you know, it's not that they're right or you're right. I'm just saying that there are different perspectives.
And that's exactly what your committee is for.
Yes.
So, you know, I just had this one recommendation. I mean, if you need more help, volunteers, you know, I'm sure there's plenty of citizens that are willing to do that. I know I am.
No, and we appreciate your testimony. Thank you very much. We will now hear from Ellen Farnham from Tamworth.
Hi, I want to thank you for taking the time to consider my comments. I would like to express, as a slightly different opinion, my high degree of confidence and trust in New Hampshire's time-tested election process. In the 2020 election, I worked as an election inspector in the town of Tamworth, where I live. Over the course of the long polling hours, I was able to observe firsthand the committed citizens serving at the polls. Moderators, supervisor of the checklist, town clerk, select board members, and trained voting clerks made sure every vote was counted fairly and accurately. Every step of the process was open, nonpartisan, and obviously fair. Votes were meticulously counted and recounted at the end of the night, and every ballot was accounted for. Absentee ballots were counted out loud with witnesses present. The same-day registration tables were busy but able to help first-time voters. I am confident that the votes were similarly counted with integrity throughout the state. Today, I find myself dismayed and disheartened by the continued conspiracy theories that surround our national and New Hampshire state elections. The theories that promote voter fraud are wholly untrue and are expressed by a small but vocal minority of the population. I have followed the controversies here in our state closely, and the facts are clear. Our elections are fair. Any claims of voter fraud in past elections have been routinely reported to the Attorney General's office and investigated thoroughly. Results in past elections were not changed or affected by voter fraud. If there is a conspiracy at work, it is to promote the myth of fraudulent voting and to force our legislature to adopt laws that further restrict access to voting. I strongly urge this committee to support the facts and to help the public see these truths. Our past elections have been conducted fairly. Safeguards to protect our election results were. Our state examined voter fraud or problems in counting ballots in past elections and openly reported their findings. New laws that restrict access to registration and voting are not needed and discourage legitimate voter participation. Please speak up for our hard-working poll workers and the town officials who for years have made our elections run smoothly and proclaim confidence in our New Hampshire election process.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the committee?
Thank you.
Hearing none, our next testimony will be given by Judith Hackerson from Franklin, New Hampshire.
Ellen, you wrote mine. I made extra copies. Do you like to have extra copies? Okay.
This is Judith Hackerson.
Oh dear. Should I read this?
You can do whatever.
Oh, I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah. Okay. My name is Judith Anderson, and I'm a resident and registered voter in the city of Franklin. I have also been for many years and continue to be a worker at the polls at my Ward 3 voting place, most recently elected as supervisor of the checklist. As such, I have had a bird's eye view of how elections operate on the local level. And I will reiterate what my predecessor has said in that through that process, I see how painstakingly this job is carried out by volunteers, by the moderator, and just how much oversight there is. I have every confidence in the way elections have been handled in our community. There may be some outlying communities that do have problems, and they should be addressed. They should be listened to, and they should be addressed. I was kind of saddened to hear how the people of Camden felt. I did some research on the path that the Attorney General's office follows in processing complaints of potential voter fraud. This is only half of the responses that I started printing out when issues have been brought to their attention. From the period January 20th to June 20th, a total of 39 complaints were filed. 14 alleged wrongful voting, 8 alleged illegal campaign activities, 17 alleged election official misconduct. Of those still under investigated from June 2018 to December 2019, there are 4 wrongful voting in which charges have been filed and 1 wrongful voting which is still under investigation. There are 1,009,004 registered voters in the state of New Hampshire in 2020. 814,092 cast ballots, 73%, which is an incredibly high number, and we should be proud of it. The 39 complaints filed represent 4/1,000ths of 1% of all votes cast. To clarify, that is 0.004 of 1%. That doesn't scream a lot of election fraud going on. But what this does scream is that when the Attorney General's office is made aware of it, a great deal of effort goes into investigating every single incident, and that the people that are involved receive data on how their case was treated. And to me, we are following everything that we could possibly follow to make sure that voters should have confidence in our election process. There will be errors. There's nothing you can do to make everything perfect. But there is not rampant fraud in the state of New Hampshire or in this country. And I am concerned that this committee may be spending taxpayer monies to hold hearings to help placate some of the people who just simply don't want to hear the facts. And I'm hoping that the result of this committee will not be that the legislature feels that they have to start putting in more restrictive voting laws that are going to be harmful to the vast majority of the voters in this state. I applaud everyone who takes the time to pay attention to what's going on. I applaud everyone who takes the time to volunteer at the polls. I can tell you that it is very, very, very hard to find volunteers at the polls. I know that from years of experience as one of those volunteers. They just aren't there. There aren't many people that want to devote 12 hours minimum to sitting at the polls to do their job. They don't want to take time off from their job. It's mostly old people like me that are doing it. And at some point, I'm not going to be able to do it. So the fallacy that there are thousands of people just waiting to fill these positions is false. I'm 77. One of these days, I'm going to age out of this. I'm still willing to do it.
No time soon. No time soon.
No. But anyway,
Well, thank you.
That's my thing.
Thanks. Please stay for a moment, and
Yep.
we'll have a conversation. I want to, first of all, thank you for your testimony and tell you and assure you that the state is not spending a dime on this activity. We are all here on our own nickel. We are all here on our own time, and we're doing this because, like you, we believe in the voting process, we believe in the state, and we believe that it should be the best it can be. Having said that, I know that you are for the most part, happy with how the process works. I would be curious to hear you comment just briefly on how we can make it even better so that those people who have more concerns than you might feel that the system is actually able to be improved to their satisfaction as well.
Well, I guess in listening to the previous speakers, if there have been inappropriate procedures at any community, that they be thoroughly looked into. And if it means that just some people haven't been properly trained, make sure that that happens. Obviously, not being a part of their experience, I couldn't speak to what might have gone wrong there, but they deserve to be listened to and to have that, investigated. Again, I think the issue of finding adequate poll workers is something that somehow the state should look at. I don't know how they could do it. I guess individual communities and perhaps with some guidance from the state need to come up with some ideas of how to recruit people who are willing to work at the polls to get out the message of how important it is that more people participate. Again, the more that do participate, the more you begin to respect the process and not feel like you're a victim of it, but that you can be proud of it. My experience in Franklin has been wonderful. So
If I may, one of the things that occurs to me, and I would be curious not to expand the conversation on this point, but to hear from anybody who wants to on the sidebar, we have heard communities that have difficult, deep problems with various aspects of their voting process. We have heard from other communities that are very happy and very solid and very confident about their voting process. Would it be worthwhile for the state to encourage those with little or no problems to partner up with those that are struggling and see if there's a way that those kinds of companion communities could help each other? That's just one idea that popped into my mind that I'd be curious to hear your response to.
perhaps, but I believe there's also an association of town clerks, town and city clerks. We have one here. It used to be in Franklin. And I don't know how much is accomplished through that forum.
Well, a good idea is networking, to see, bounce ideas off of different people and see. And there are various groups. There's clerk groups and there's moderator groups through the New Hampshire Municipal Association.
Well, we'll leave it to the town clerks and the towns themselves, but these are some of the ideas that we obviously want to be thinking about. Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions from the committee? Hearing none, thank you very much. We'll next hear from Ruth Larson from Alton, New Hampshire.
Thank you, committee members. My name is Ruth Larson. I live in Alton. I want to mention to Mr. Swett that you're not in the place where the most action is happening right now, but the time you mentioned Guilford, Guilford is heavily in the news today, as every day recently.
Oh, we're talking about gun stuff.
Yes. This committee today is
where I
a
learned
lot
to
less
speak.
publicity than everybody over at gun stuff. Anyway, over the years, I've been involved in the election process in New Hampshire in a variety of ways. First, as a totally reliable voter who votes in every election. Next, as a supervisor of the checklist in Alton for a number of years, working hard to keep our records straight and to register new voters who I have in Alton were almost consistently of the opposite party from and nobody ever raised any concern about my appropriateness of working endless hours registering them. I also testified twice before the election law committee on the district and was disappointed to hear how little the testimony influenced their ultimate decisions and the legislature's decisions. In my view, the Secretary of State's office should be a bully pulpit for the facts, telling and showing the voters how reliable our elections are. But my impression is that over the recent years, there's been a little bit of a double message coming out of that office. First, by having New Hampshire participate in the former president's voter fraud commission, which fortunately fizzled, and now creating the Committee on Voter Confidence. And when I say this, I do not mean to criticize the individual members who I respect and applaud for your work and volunteering your time. But the mere creation of this commission, this committee, in my view, has the effect of undermining voter confidence because it suggests that voter integrity is a real and serious issue in New Hampshire. It feeds into the big lie theory, which is poisoning our country nationally and increasingly in New Hampshire. The conspiracy theories, the attempts to require paper ballots only, the disparagement of our local election officials, all part of the same movement. It should be noted that many of the same people, and I'm not referring to people in this room today, but more statewide, many of the same people who have been attacking our elections in New Hampshire are elected representatives. They're claiming fraud in the election process. Some of them signed manifestos saying they're no longer citizens of the state of New Jersey. And yet, they seem to single out only those portions of the ballot where their candidate lost. Those who are state representatives are not turning in their rights to be a state representative. They're not saying, I wasn't duly elected. And I have to say, I was somebody who ran for the House of Representatives against one of these people. And although and that was Ray Howard from Auburn, he and Terry were two of the representatives who voted for the secession amendment, pushing the fraud theory, and yet they claim to have been duly elected. I, who lost against one of them, have never, ever claimed that in Alton there was any fraud in the election. So the hypocrisy of those people who claim fraud on the one hand and yet sit in Concord claiming to be our state representatives is simply astonishing. And I would like to point to the testimony of Mr. Smith at the beginning, who talked at one point about repetition. And that word stuck in my mind. When you keep repeating something, it starts to have an effect. And we hear that regarding campaigning. People should repeat the same message. Well, that same theory is true with election fraud. The more you keep repeating it, the more you get people maybe believing it. And even if the repetition is put in the form of a question, for example, do you believe there was election fraud? If you ask that question enough times, my guess is that Mr. Smith, as the pollster, would say that yes, you ask it enough times, it starts to get believed. And we know from polling information and polling studies that the way questions are phrased can have an effect. And in my view, Secretary Scanlon should be using the authority of his office for good and to stop letting those who want to stand out control the narrative. More emphasis on expanding voting rights with automatic registration, online registration, and things like that would be a better use of the time. And I certainly hope that this committee will support the accuracy, the fairness, and the freeness of our elections. But I think the time spent on this could have been spent better elsewhere. Thank you.
Question before you depart. Any questions from the committee?
Not a question, but just to assuage your fears a little bit. Secretary Scanlon has stated on many occasions in front of this committee that he believes our elections are fair, have integrity, and are secure, and are the best in the country. So you shouldn't think that by looking into all of the things we're looking into, somehow he was trying to undermine anything.
I understand your point, and I thank you for it, but if you take these kinds of questions to a further absurdity, then it becomes clear that asking the question itself repeatedly becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. At some point, you have to simply dismiss the nuttiness.
I would just like to ask a question regarding your final statement where you said that the energy that this committee has expended could be better used elsewhere. Where else? Please tell us. You left that as an open question.
No,
I'd like to know your interpretation of how that energy should be applied.
The energy I was referring to be better spent was the Secretary of State's office, not the committee, which I applaud for its civic-mindedness and energy. No, the Secretary of State's office, I would like to see putting its energy more towards things like automatic registration when you, voter registration when you register a vehicle or get a driver's license, allowing people to have online voter registration, things like that. And then even maybe improving its online presence and making it more user-friendly. Even those of us with a fair amount of education sometimes find it pretty difficult to navigate. So those are areas where I'm talking about efforts, time and effort.
So we're grateful that you took your time to come to tell us, the Special Committee on Voter Confidence, of ways that the Secretary of State's office can improve, and therefore this all works together is all I'm trying to say. So I think we have accomplished something with your comments. Thank you very much.
I think there's some humor there, but anyway.
That's exactly where it is. We will next hear from Bob Perry of Stratford. Now, let me ask Bob, you've testified before, correct?
I have.
Okay, well Sue Nastasi from Rollinsford, she has not, so we're going to let Sue testify, and we've got you and Al are going to be our last two on the list.
What's your last name, sir?
This is Sue Nastasi, Nastasi.
And thank you for pronouncing it so correctly. I'm used to it, but you're But, yeah, good afternoon. I'm Sue Nastasi, one of the supervisors of the checklist in Rollinsford, and very proudly a state board member of New Hampshire's League of Women Voters. So it was one of the first things when registering to vote in the state that I got my hands on the manual of voting, because I just eat up all the election voting, the laws. And actually, I have a copy here of your mission statement, and I'm sure that you all are, following it to a T. And because of time, I was about to read it, but not needed. But I'll just say, in the first sentence, voter confidence decline, I'll just say that when the commission was first formed, there was, many of us across the state were like, why do we need this? Because like Mr. Cook said just recently about how Mrs. Gallon has said that there is a lot of confidence in statewide, but there's a lot of hiccups along the way and bumps in the road, and and everyone has good to voice their opinion. And I'm not one to labor on statistics, because basically I can refer to my nerdy techie husband that to put together a graph or a chart, he'll say, well, what does the boss want it to say? You know, so, you know, I'll be more of the opinion, but I won't say 40%, 50% of things like that, because, you know, it's who puts it together, really. And in New Hampshire, voters do have confidence in their election. I really believe that. And on election day, I just know that the poll workers, including myself, it doesn't matter how personally they vote. You know, it's get out that vote. And I know that it's, you know, presidential, that's when the biggest lines are. But again, it's every single level important. It really is. And I was going to quote from the former Secretary of State, there was no evidence of voter fraud. But again, I appreciate what Mr. Cook just said recently. And so far as how to improve, with disappointment when Senate Bill 418 was signed into law, it was a disappointment. And I thought, well, okay, from where I stand, the work I do as a supervisor, if given additional work, requirements for the supervisor, you know, actually that's fine. It's not, I won't say bulking extra work. It's my job to follow the voting and the election laws. But that particular law, I don't see it's needed, but it was signed into law. I go along with other towns, poll workers, I agree that say that it can be problematic. Excuse me, I guess my voice is taking a hike. But, it is great that this committee is bipartisan. But, you know, unfortunately it's not diversified, but I have to look at like the state, you know, which also brings up about the first in the nation. And if I can separate myself of, you know, maybe the tradition, you know, being diversified and seeing what America looks like and being first in the nation, that's when it's most prominent, you know, being, you know, always looking at election results. So I can see how others have tossed around the idea of a different state because the diversified. There's other states that are more diversified, but you know, then there's other states that are more ethnic, and then, you know, that's how the different states are. But with tradition and good for business, it's great for New Hampshire to stay first in the nation. And as an opinion, so far as hand counting, well, for Rollinsford, I'll just give the example of the annual water and sewer district. We hand count those. And we have one voting machine, and it is tested before election day. And people can be in attendance watching, that's fine. And those in attendance, I guess they're one from each party that come as challengers for election day. But, you know, that's fine. just as long as they can, ask questions and they can watch, all good. And what else? There's so much that's already been said this afternoon, which is terrific. And I'll just say that this is my first time up in Laconia. This was my trip from Rollinsford, but anyway, thank you for your time. And I didn't realize that this was all volunteer, but it's a good honor to be selected for this commission.
Believe me, they couldn't pay us to do this.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the committee? Hearing none, we appreciate your testimony. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the first of repeats who signed the top of the list, Al Rendano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're very welcome.
If I may approach this testimony.
Please.
I have written testimony, but I will be brief. I'm here today before you with some relatively new information. In the town of Kensington, New Hampshire, I asked for an investigation because, from the Department of Justice, because the activity logs and maintenance logs were not complied with, did not have witnesses in a majority of the cases. And the finding is in Exhibit 1. And you'll find the Department of Justice responded to me and basically said that on page 3 at the very, of the exhibit, basically said, yes, there was problems with the machine, witnessing, yes, there was problems with maintenance, yes, but in our findings, the only requirement to have a legitimate election in any town, including Kensington, is a 50 ballot test in the test mode. Now, I find the logic not only troubling, but I can't even speak to it. Because we had at the last committee hearing, and when it was about machines, you had the Secretary of State's office testify that you needed to have witnessed access logs for the machines. And what good are these logs or witnesses if all somebody has to do is do a 50 ballot test according to the Department of Justice? I find the logic, and this is where people lose confidence. How can we stand up in a committee and swear to something and then get a report from an investigation and it's 180 degrees out? I don't understand that. And the second is Exhibit 2. You'll find in Exhibit 2, we asked, me, 20 questions to the Department of Justice based on what I heard at the last meeting here, the last conference. And I'll give you just an example of 4. Question 1, how does your office, town officials confirm that machines have not been altered as it pertains to RSA 65641 when maintenance is authorized or completed on a regular basis or emergency basis? Please include any audit standards, chains of custody, requirements used to determine and support this. The response, all 20 questions are the same. This office does not have document requests. Does not have a document request. Now, I understand 91A says they don't have to answer a question, but my God, it doesn't require you not to either. And question 5, how does your town office verify, check, or maintain a record of what is programmed into the counting device, EPROMS, in memory card before an election or after? The response, this office does not have a document responsive to your request. Well, just the last one here. How is the state not violating federal law 52 USC 20701, retention and preservation of voting records for 22 months when we send memory cards immediately back to LHS Associates, RSA 65642? The office does not have a document response to this request. This is troubling. This is not only troubling, These are the people who enforce the laws that the Secretary of State writes. The last one, question 12. The General Board, New Hampshire Secretary of State, Department of Justice, Governor, we served a notice of memorial and remonstrance and an affidavit of trespass and infringement on constitutional rights regarding the unconstitutional use of electronic voting machines, RSA 65640. The response, the office does not have a document that to respond to the request. So, yeah, we're here for voter confidence, and to the people who think we're nuts for doing this. This is not nuts. This is, as the professor was saying, is it perception or reality? I'm here to tell you it's reality versus perception. It's unacceptable. We need to find a solution to this. It can't continue like this. It can't have the Secretary of State saying one thing and the Department of Justice another. And I take my hat off and I salute Secretary Scanlon, because the only way to redemption is to have the guts and courage that he showed to have this committee, and for you people to show up and volunteer your time. We're not going to fix this unless we're really honest about it. And there has been enough exposed. The last thing I want to leave with you is I need to ask this question because it's troubling me. And I heard this today, and I want maybe the Secretary of State to tell me that I'm mistaken. Is it true that if you get a ballot emailed and applied by email to get a packet, an absentee ballot, and do you have to indicate on there that you're a U.S. citizen? We had a student that just told us they applied by email to get a packet, and she did not have to prove she was a U.S. citizen. If she came in to vote the same day, she would have to be in the loop. That would have to happen. She confirmed this with the Secretary of State's office. Now I'll get her information. But this is troubling to me when people apply for absentee ballots and they don't have to prove that they're an American citizen.
So, if I might, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
A person who is requesting an absentee ballot already has to be on the checklist to be able to receive one. A person can vote in certain situations by absentee registration, and in that event, they would certainly have to prove that, give some documentation that they're a United States citizen. So maybe we can talk about the details of the question later, but in the number one instance, you can't get an absentee ballot unless you're on the checklist. And if you're on the checklist, at some point in the past, you've already proven that you're a United States citizen.
Well, I'll get more information for you and share that. But once again, I don't want to take any more time, and I've come before you many times, and thank you for this opportunity. But I really would like to, we need to come to, they can't happen like this. It just can't continue.
Well, and I think to your, before I pass it off to my co-chair, I think to your credit, Al, what you have done is that you have exposed errors in the system that could be just simple mistakes or could be fraudulent intent. But what I'm hearing you speak about most importantly is that if there is a process that is set up that is supposed to be transparent and consistent, voter confidence would most benefit by seeing that transparency and that consistency applied in every instance. And that is something that I think you very responsibly have presented to the committee. I take it very seriously, and I yield the rest of my time to my co-chair.
Well, not all the rest of your time, because somebody else wanted to say something. You've done a thorough review of New Hampshire election law. We know that from your testimony. It strikes me, having had to deal with those laws as chairman of the Law Commission for 4 years and I can count, that we have a very complicated system in the statutes. And they're not statutes. Somebody said the statutes were written by the Secretary of State. He's got enough to do. He doesn't write the statutes. But my question is, do you think it would be helpful for us to say to the legislature, because we have no power to do anything other than write a report. Look at all of our election laws and see if they can be simplified somewhat, because I can tell you one thing, having been through a lot of hearings at the Bylaw Commission, one thing I will never be is a moderator or a clerk, because that's got to be, right up there with a root canal someday. But because and I'm serious about this, because you've looked at these rules so often and looked at them in such detail, do you think they could be simplified and made easier to understand?
Absolutely, sir. And let me explain very interestingly how the Justice Department tied themselves in a knot. I went with 2 other witnesses to the Justice Department when we first started this part of looking at activity logs. Something that they said, and I have witnessed to, is that, to your point earlier, the selectmen are the responsible party. If there is a challenge of unconstitutionality of the machines, it won't be against the state, it will be against them personally and the town bond. This is where RSA 6540 never really clarified itself, because it was on a trial basis only for 38 years. Trial against what? The second part, if you look at the response from the Department of Justice, what they're saying is RSA 6541, the certification, what makes a machine certified or altered, has no play in the rest of the rules. And so, like in Kensington, we just had, they just replaced a circuit board or a board on the machine. In RSA 6541, has the machine been altered? There's nothing that says, hey, if you do this, it's an altered machine. If you change the clock, it's an altered machine. There's nothing. So it has to default to, yes, it's altered, because there is no other way to describe it. And to your point, sir, this is the problem. We keep chasing our tail with the regulation instead of looking at the regulation and really confining it to what it means. I think they were written after the fact, and you can see in this case, even the Department of Justice is tying themselves in a knot. So I agree.
Well, I briefly skimmed their response to your 91A request, and I will say, having been one for 50 years, it sounded like a lot of lawyer stuff to me.
Yes, it did. I don't want to take some of the gentleman's time.
Thank you very much. Yes, Jim Splaine.
I do have something to offer that's taught by a question. You've done some good work here, and I think the answers that you didn't receive should have been a little more detailed. And you did some great work. And several people have brought up some important points. We have a dilemma here, in that we're out of business by October, maybe September. We're not going to be writing, and I don't know if we're going to be suggesting, and that's decision by the 8 of us, as to whether or not we're going to recommend specific law changes. The Secretary of State's office and the good Secretary of State might throw the snowball now and then on an idea for a change, but they do not specifically propose the legislature make changes. They respond to the legislation proposed by 400 legislators, 424. I spent 30 years as a House member, 24 years, and 6 as a senator, and I know that the legislature in New Hampshire is very responsive. You've got legislators from every community, virtually every community, all your neighbors. So I suggest that you contact the legislators, go to the election law committee meetings that are going to be coming up starting in December and January for the new legislative session, and get the kind of legislation you think needs to be made, because they are the ones who are going to be deciding changes that we cannot do. We're out of business in September or October. Have you done that? Do you plan to do more of that?
Yeah, let me be clear. This year, 50 LSRs left. Think about it. State of New Hampshire, we're the closest to the people. For every representative is 3,000 people. 50 LSRs made their way this year, last session, to the State House. 1 got passed through the Ballot Law Commission. 50 of them. So people are frustrated.
Of the legislature.
When it never made it to the Ballot Law Commission, through the legislature and to the Ballot Law Commission.
So the legislature did not pass it?
50 of them, and I have a list of every one of them. I'd be happy to share with you, if you like. So the people, what happens is people are getting frustrated because no one's listening, right? And that's why I'm grateful. I know this is very difficult for Secretary Scanlon, but without him, none of us would be here, and I'm really grateful and respectful. And I hope at any time I'm here, I'm not ever disrespectful to anyone, because I don't mean to be. But I'd like to ask you a question. In 2016, I looked at all the information. You were against the machines. You were against the machines in 2016.
Through the years,
why was that?
Because of some legislators, Betty Hall among them, a hero of mine, Barbara Richardson. I've been persuaded that hand count makes more sense for most communities, except for the large ones, than machines. Billy Gardner and I used to have discussions about that, and one of my disagreements. I think that when you get to the big communities, hand count gets very messy, very muddied. I've been involved in recounts done at the State House and at the archives after elections, and I see some of the dilemmas that are faced by those towns, cities, with thousands and thousands of hand counts needing to be done. That said, bottom line, for those who like the bottom line concept, it's a decision by cities and towns. And I don't know if the legislature wants to take the step of saying no machines at all, and everything has to be done by hand count. But that is, I think, where the decision lies.
Thank you. And as we all know, there's many countries that do make a civil commitment to do it. So
And there are ways to do it. Certainly you can have, I don't know if anybody wants a National Guard to do it, because that's kind of, military government, but there are certainly ways to have other people involved in the the hand count process. Smaller communities, it probably makes a lot of sense.
it was really interesting reading the history, because you were prominent in that debate. So
Thanks for looking at it.
Doug Teschner has a question.
Well, I really appreciate the discussion we're having now, because I think it speaks to something really important. And I did serve on the Election Law Committee a long time ago, but more recently I was engaged by the Secretary of State's office to have meetings with local election officials and help to write or rewrite the election procedure manual, which really details how it works. And I was struck by how complicated our elections are. On the other hand, this is sort of the balance point. When I see some of the legislation coming in, it seems to want to make it more complicated. There's a lot of checks and balances in there which are legitimate, that need to be there. And I don't know what the solution is. And it's certainly going to be hard to get anything through the legislature, as you pointed out. What I worked on was making it as simple as possible so that people could understand it. That was kind of sort of my approach. I wasn't trying to change, I wasn't asked to change the laws or proposed to change the laws. There's things in there like checklists and other kinds of things for the local election officials that I helped write. But I developed a real appreciation of how complicated the elections are. The more complicated it is, the more confusing it is. But there's also the checks and balances that go with it. And I don't know what the answer is, so this is more of an observation than a question. But I appreciate the questions and the conversation we're having, because I think it's important. And one of the things that I think we need to wrestle with is, if people have complaints, how do we process the complaints? It's pretty clear to me that the AG is kind of overwhelmed. I just saw a complaint in my town that was made 16 months ago, and they just made a ruling on it, which I thought they missed the mark on, personally. But
we're in agreement then.
So what's the process for making the complaints? Well, I also thought the complaint was made against a local election official that I thought was unfair, and the AG ruled for the people making the complaint. So it can kind of go both ways. How do we create a process where where the laws are clear and also people can make complaints and get reasonable answers? Doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy all the time, because they're not. But it seems like the process needs some tinkering with. I'm not sure quite what the solution is, but that's just
a good homework assignment from our colleague here to all of us in the room. Thank you very much.
One last thing is if you could update the videos, because people are suspect that the videos are 67, testimony is 70 days behind. They suspect that there's something not being.
I appreciate that. We are struggling with that continually. I would direct your attention to the Secretary of State office.
Thank you.
They're working on that. Thank you. The last testimony is Mr. Perry, Bob Perry from Stratford.
Thank you, members of the commission. I'll be 4 minutes with including a 1 minute aside.
I'm not even going to look at my watch.
Thank you. In its multiple public hearings, the State's Commission on Voter Confidence has sought suggestions. I end this presentation with suggestions, but begin with a broadened view of the significant challenges we face as a nation of the self-governed. In the critical swing state of Pennsylvania, the established nominee for governor, Doug Mastriano, promises to appoint a compliant Secretary of State who will, upon his command, reverse state or federal election results not to his liking, obliterating the votes of millions in the birthplace of democracy. Less than 2 weeks ago, undaunted and now 18 months post-Biden certification, Trump asked Wisconsin Assembly Speaker Robin Vos to overturn the 2020 presidential election results, obliterating the votes of millions in that state. And the Wisconsin Assembly's Elections Committee Chair is also calling for the invalidating of Biden's victory. One of Trump's attorneys publicly announced last week that if Republicans take majorities in Washington in November, they will attempt to reinstate Trump through withdrawal of electors in 3 Biden-won states, obliterating the votes of tens of millions of voters in 3 states. This is a headline. A Russian state TV host said Moscow hasn't decided whether to reinstall, in quotes, Trump as president in 2024. My suggestions. The state needs to make maximum use of HAVA funds or other grants and, if not, state funding to inform voters of the current basic requirements for voting. These public service announcements should include television ads placed well in advance of elections to allow voters time to adjust. This information would minimize mistakes made by voters and reduce state costs for unnecessary investigations. The state needs to secure and utilize federal funding offered to states to improve election infrastructure, offering opportunities to enhance security and replace outdated equipment. New Hampshire's share of a current $400 million U.S. House compromise appropriation is $1.8 million for year 2023. The state needs to join 31 of its peers and the District of Columbia in modernizing its elections by subscribing to the Election Registration Information Center, also known as ERIC, a tested and successful voter roll program that effectively keeps states' voter rolls clean by checking for people who may have moved to a different state, changed address within a state, or died. This program would enhance the state's normal investigative policies and procedures. A slight aside. Among other needed campaign finance reforms, the legislature needs to persist in closing the limited liability corporation, also known as LLC, loophole, which allows owners of multiple LLCs to make multiple maximum campaign contributions through each of their LLCs. The owner of 6 LLCs can legally make contributions 6 times the maximum, $90,000, versus the owner of no LLCs whose maximum contribution is $15,000. This loophole tips the balance of political influence substantially to the state's moneyed interests. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse recently revealed a so-called dark money campaign contribution made by a single entity in the amount of $17 million. It is dark money because the amount is known, but the source is not. This is obscene. We all want free, fair, and accurate elections, but those goals cannot be obtained through punitive regulation. Leadership is needed to bolster voter confidence, which can be done through much improved government communication with granite status, challenging the big lie with facts and funding. Thank you.
We thank you very much for your time. Doug?
Yeah, I appreciate bringing up the money because we haven't really talked about that. I don't know what we can do about it. It seems like it's driven by the Supreme Court, but I wanted to ask you about Eyring. You know, there was like everything, I mean, Eyring is designed so that there's cross-checking across states whether people voted in multiple states is what it's designed to do. And like everything, I guess, it takes on a partisan hinge because all of a sudden there was a Republican version that was different, or somebody else, was it Kobach, or somebody else came up with a different version, and there's been criticisms that Eyring is partisan, and do you have any insights for us about any of that?
The Kansas Kobach cross-check program went belly up quite soon after there was discussion about it in New Hampshire. Its use of metrics was very limited. I think there were only 3 metrics included in that cross-check program. The Eyring program is much more robust. I guess in dealing, you know, with any human, nothing is perfect. But as I indicated in my presentation, if you have 2 heads working on the same project, it could well be better than just one. So the Eyring program, in concert with the state's own investigative abilities, seems to me to be a winning strategy.
Any other questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. We'll get a copy of the written. That's great. Thank you very much.
In fact, quite immediately.
There we go. The sooner the better. We appreciate everybody's attendance today. We hope that this has been as an illuminating meeting for you as it has for me, at least. I won't speak for my colleagues. Our next meeting is going to be held in Nashua at the Nashua City Hall. That's located at 229 Main Street in Nashua, and my good co-chair will be chairing that meeting. Brad Cook will have those responsibilities and duties. And is that good? Is that the evening meeting? It starts at, I believe, 5 o'clock and goes till a reasonable hour thereafter.
I think we prefer you. You keep us to us. With Brad, we're going to be there till midnight.
Well, I did nothing. It was my good neighbors here from the Laconia area who are able to keep us on time.
What day was that?
That's going to be on the 23rd. The 15th of August.
Thanks.
Is there any other business to bring before the committee this afternoon? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn the movie and a second? All in favor?
Right.
Any opposed?
The
The meeting is adjourned.